In June and July of 2021, a new global hegemon, the Third Empire of Bardonia, almost took over the entire world in an event that would culminate in the destruction of nations, mass genocide, and a cold war between North and South, eventually boiling over into a real war, only matched in sense and size and scale by its predecessor, the Trillium War. This is all real history which took place on the Stoneworks Minecraft server world of Rathnir. Become an emperor of a large sprawling empire, found colonies in the name of your crown, build a large democracy full of intricate political discussion, and become one of the richest people in Minecraft history. This is the second part of my 3-part series on the Allium-Coalition War. You can watch part 1 right here, as without it, a lot of this will not make much sense. With all of that out of the way, let's begin. When we last left off, Emperor Mobius of Bardonia would be greeted by the Daedalus prophet of the Path of Prosperity, the last of the prophets of the 5 paths. Mobius promptly resigned from his position as emperor, and allowed the prophet to ascend to the role of emperor, proclaiming the Third Empire of Bardonia. Word of this declaration quickly spread across Rathnir and even to the new world of Eldom. The nations of the world watched on as the new Bardonian Empire experienced a renaissance, quickly shooting to the top of the population charts, coming close to even Oldorash, nearly tripling their population over the course of a single month. And while the new Bardonia was rising, the old Viodoxa was collapsing. Ever since the Ferryman War, Viodoxa had been continuously destabilizing. They had lost roughly 26% of their population since the war, and now were struggling to keep themselves afloat. Alongside this, the Archon of Viodoxa, Valen McSpiegel, was growing gradually more unreliable as a leader, as his mental health deteriorated. Alongside this, the former Archon, Loic, returned to Viodoxa, beginning the Purple Insurrection in a hope to seize the country from Valen's grip. This all came to a head on June 19, 2021, when Valen would proclaim the dissolution of the Archonate along provincial boundaries and offed himself the next day. This shocked the world, as this left Oldorash as the last standing southern power to combat a potential Bardonian/Neodyne threat from the north. Behind the scenes, however, things were not as it seems. Valen had left a paper trail, giving the remaining province leaders a way to reform Viodoxa in a way that would keep Loic out of power. And so, under the leadership of Archon Yazop of Aditum and Numis Mispiegel of Valron, the second Archonate was proclaimed, reuniting all the provinces with the exception of Western Sparwood, which had united with Laith Greenstem. While Viodoxa had returned, and kept itself alive, this move dramatically affected the world around them moving forward. Starting immediately after the Prophet came to power, Bardonia began looking outwards towards their neighbours, expanding as part of the Path of Prosperity. Under the Second Empire, they had already invaded some of their neighbours, such as Valia, Halj, Andorn, and Heli. The occupation of these countries was not particularly welcomed by the general population, especially in Valia and Halj. It was during this time that the Third Tsardom of Ryzan, under the Zephyros administration, began extending support to nations occupied by Bardonia under the previously established Air Ryzan Initiative, a service independent of the Ryzani government transporting weapons and other supplies to rebel groups. While this had previously extended only as far as Andorn, a region which Ryzan had heavy stakes in keeping on their side during the Everleski administration, it now extended to Valia, Halj, Baconia, and later Lennox, when they were invaded and occupied by Bardonia on June 10th. Alongside this, Bardonia began extending further support to their allies, the Allium Alliance, to help them grow their own influences. They assisted in acquiring Mudruk Pektai as a vassal of Niedia, and they expanded their own influence through the Abyssal Isles, Kave, and Laith, as well as finally reintegrating Oron's Peak on June 13th. In response to the Viodoxan collapse and the SRDA being rendered practically useless without a core command structure that could lead in a Viodoxan absence, Bardonia began to finally prepare for war against the Second Ryzani Republic, and declared war against them on June 23rd. Despite the return of Viodoxa, the SRDA still refused to support Ryzan, and backed away from the situation under the guise of not supporting an anti-monarchist state, dissolving months later. This left Ryzan diplomatically isolated, forced to combat against the entire Allium Alliance alone. It was a dire situation, but nonetheless the Ryzanis decided to stand their ground and fight back against Bardonia. Even normally neutral nations like Theos Esukdal supported the Bardonian invasion, and applauded the Allium Alliance as their troops marched on Tossograd. On the night of June 25th, Allium troops marched from Darastrok to... wait, hold on. Ugralon? but that's part of... wait. Uni got East and West confused. Yes, the Bardonians marched eastward instead of westwards in their initial assault, as the Prophet couldn't discern the difference between East and West. Jesus Christ.
What are you talking about, cracker?
When the Allium forces finally learned about the cardinal positions on a compass, they marched in the correct direction from Darastarok towards Tossograd. 3 Allium Alliance regiments would be facing 4 Ryzani regiments spread out across the country, in Carthia, Volgograd and Tossograd. The Ryzanis were correct in believing that the Bardonians would march on Tossograd instead of the much closer actual capital of Carthia, as they believed the Bardonians valued a PR victory over a systematic one. They were correct, as the Bardonians marched around Carthia and surrounded Tossograd. Alanoran forces occupied Deutzan, and Baconian garrisons seized Ryzani's colonies in Helmia. Despite warnings of a potential attack on Volgograd, the 3-pronged attack on Tossograd went underway, with the fighting descending into house-to-house combat in a bloody mess. Task Force Volgograd was redirected to assist in Tossograd, followed by Task Force Carthia. The Bardonians would later seize Carthia with only a few reserves left in Carthia to defend it. The Bardonians would finally seize Tossograd in the early hours of June 26th. After this crushing defeat, the petty kingdom of the Tsardom of Nevskoslavia would secede from Ryzan, and later that day President Zephyros, in violation of the constitution of Ryzan, would sign an unconditional surrender in Volgograd, which allowed Bardonia to occupy all of Ryzan's territory, as he resigned from his position as president. The Nevskoslavian secession would be brutally suppressed, one of the first of many acts of extreme violence against the native ethnicities of Ryzani territory. During the month-long occupation of Ryzani territory, the Bardonians and the Westreach government would order one of the largest mass genocides in world history, executing 113,000 ethnic Ryzanis and erecting mass graves across the Vonskia and Nevskoslavian countryside to bury the dead. Displacement and executions of ethnic minorities have also traces in Lennox, Val, Baconia, and the former lands of the Sand Republic. These killings during this period would stunt Ryzan's population growth to the point where it would never recover to pre-occupation numbers. Behind the scenes, what remained of the Ryzani government under the leadership of Mokoslavs Kowalski reorganized under the Interim Ryzani Governing Committee, aka the IRGC, and spread out into the countryside, taking arms in small pockets across the former territories. While the Bardonians initially split Ryzan into Fetele province in the north, a free zone which contained the majority of Ryzan's wilderness, and Osterheim province in the south, a zone directly administrated by the Bardonian government containing most of the country's major cities. From Fetele, Jacob Azarov would eventually proclaim the new Tsardom of Westreach, a Bardonian provincial government spanning all of former Ryzan. This was confirmed on June 30th when the leaders of the Allium Alliance attending his inauguration as the new Tsar. This new government was made up of many former Ryzanis who returned to help govern from nations like Barbosa. The Westreach government would control most of central Ryzan and the population centres, with the IRGC being located in the outer rim of the country where occupation was harder to enforce. They set up operations out of the cities of Donkosgrad and Novobareska, setting these as forward bases while they started training recruits in foreign countries such as Olderash, Viodoxa, and even secretly in Alanor, one of the members of the Allium Alliance, without the Velaris cabinet taking notice. With the Bardonians now in total hegemony over Syltor, the Prophet began looking outside of his homeland to the other continents of Rathnir. The new foreign policy aims were to bring stability to the north and gradually bring the globe under their heel, one nation at a time. This new foreign policy began almost immediately after Westreach was established in the continent of Plagos. Last time we checked on Plagos, they had just finished undergoing one of the largest crises of the time, the Donfure Crisis, where deep instability brought on by rebelling towns in a nation run by a 2B2T building group. Olderash had been sold the land in a final settlement, with the Donfure building group leaving for Eldom and the future of the territory uncertain. Now, with Olderash withdrawing from the territory on May 30th, Plagatea was fighting directly against JJ Rex's Plagadonian rebellion. This eventually became too much to handle. On the 5th of June, Plagatea would grant Plagadonia independence alongside Aurora Novum. Plagatea hoped the Plagadonians would stand by their side in defending Plagos from foreign interference. The Plagadonians, however, had other plans. The Plagadonians would approach the Allium Alliance and seek closer relations with the new Bardonian Empire under the Prophet and the Hewitt Confederation, allowing them to be involved more and more in Plagos affairs. This already destabilized Plagos, However, the Plagadonians' internal troubles would make the situation worse when an anti-interference faction of the government would overthrow the pro-Western rulers. This began the Plagadonian Emergency, an event which resulted in the Allium Alliance sending in the troops on July 4th, 2021. The nation was occupied by Allium forces led by Bardonia to restabilize the region. The anti-interference groups took up arms and fought back against Allium forces, before the Plagatans themselves would intervene alongside the Allium and crush the rebellion for good. Allium forces would eventually withdraw on July 9th, leaving the Plagatans to occupy the territory alone. This, despite being a small event on the world stage, would have major ramifications, as was the first time that the Allium Alliance acted as a single entity to intervene in a foreign country, with Bardonia leading the charge and ultimately occupying the territory during the time. It was an early taste of Bardonian expansion beyond Syltor. The Bardonians were not the only world power expanding beyond their continental boundaries, however. The Viodoxans, under the leadership of Archons Yazov and Numis McSpiegel, had been in the process of healing after the collapse and reunification of the state. Now, with a sudden boost in population similar to that of Bardonia during the earlier period, they began the process of expansion into the eastern domains of Sparwood. The Cold War between the two major powers had not really affected Sparwood up until this point, opting to form a third-party bloc of nations called the Confederation of Southern Sparwood, comprised of Frostmire, Mudrok Pektai, Fjellheim, and the UBSR. Over the months since its formation, however, the Confederation had gradually shrunk into a shadow of its former self, distancing from one another along ideological premises and goals for the bloc. This eventually resulted in Mudrok and Frostmire parting ways and dissolving the alliance, the former becoming a vassal of Asharia, and the latter forging its own path with a policy of aggressive expansionism. The UBSR was left geopolitically isolated, and as the Viodoxans acquired more land in Sparwood during the Avarian deal, the UBSR would ultimately follow the same path and unify with Viodoxa on July 8th. This was a major change in Sparwood's environment, as the most politically active southern power had just gained a large chunk of territory in central Sparwood. The Union of Free Kingdoms, or UFK, a western Sparwood nation which had been forged out of the Laith Greenstem united effort to combat Acratian imperialism, now felt cornered by Viodoxan expansionism into the continent, and, as Viodoxa had claims to a majority of their territory, they ultimately decided to join the Bardonians, reaching the Third Bardonian Empire's territorial maximum on July 8th, 2021. Upon reaching this all-time high, the Bardonians would begin trading land to bargain good relations with other countries. Plagadonia was traded with Plagatea, the Western Mesa was traded with Eldorash, Bardonian Teutonia traded with the newly formed Magisterium, Bardonian Acratia traded with the Inquisition, and finally Bardonian Seraphini traded with Viodoxa. All of these land trades were in return for neutral or positive relations, and while this was all good on the surface, below the thin layer of political jargon, a war against the Bardonians was developing, and the rise of the Third Coalition had begun. The story of the Third Coalition begins a lot earlier than one might expect, in fact, earlier than the beginning of this series. Rather, it begins in the midst of the Entropy Crusade. 4 nations, 1 pact. 3 southern nations, 1 Bardonia. To call the New Guard Pact a ceasefire would be generous, as the southern powers knew for certain that the Bardonians would not only make the war the moment it ended, but it was actively working against the rest. Eldorash and Viodoxa ultimately agreed to keep a sharp eye on their friend in the north. Following the Entropy saga and the sailing of Charon's Ferry, the Third Bardonian Empire was on the rise. Eldorash was strong and still growing, and Ulfang was a brand new mercenary group made up of former Viodoxans in exile that had been living in Tortuga. Following the invasion of Ryzan, the Bardonians continued to expand their influence and made an NAP with Magisterium. Viodoxa, Theos Esugdal, Eldorash, and Athazaland all observed this from a distance. The 4 of them were really good friends at the time, their leaders routinely convening since the old Entropy Crusade. During one meeting, the Bardonian expansion was brought up, and not one of them liked it. What they liked a lot less is the twin ultimatum sent by the Magisterium. Back to the Hub demanded that the unconditional surrender of Viodoxa on account of them having weak leadership, as Hub saw the current Argons as weak and ineffective. Meanwhile, Viewed, the leader of the Hands, sends a similar ultimatum to Solixte with no reason given. This was an issue for several reasons. Firstly, they were threatening Viodoxa, which Archon Hazel McSpiegel was angered by. Secondly, it showed to them that the Magisterium was hyper-aggressive, but notably not to the Bardonians. It seemed eerily similar to the Sorbian situation from February 2021. The the leaders wrongly assumed them to be a Bardonian puppet, when in fact they merely had close personal ties to the Bardonians, and nothing was set in stone in regards to relations. Athaz, in his own words, was pissed. These three leaders were complaining in the meeting about Bardonian aggression, and he told them that they had their chance to beat down Bardonia by working with the ferrymen instead. This was the Stockholm Syndrome they'd fought to maintain, and the three leaders did not like that argument. But Athaz was done with this quote-unquote constant Bardonian bullshit, so, annoyed by the Bardonians, and annoyed that the leaders didn't take the ferrymen's chance to fight Bardonia and still wanted to complain about them, Athaz sat them down and put forward a new plan to make an alliance. At this point, the leaders weren't all best friends at the time, especially with Valerian of Asharia and Ningel Mystic's side. Athaz also suggested getting Tortuga involved, which Alderash was in favour of but Viodoxan was not, due to the fact that Tortuga was protecting the Viodoxan exiles in Ulfang. After a long discussion, Athaz got everyone to work together. As it turns out, the Prophet was dealing with the Tortugans too, and Ulfang wished to fight the Hands at every available opportunity. The pirate lord Sexy Canadian ultimately disliked the Prophet, so chose the south over connections to Bardonia. The issue of magisterium expansionism was dealt with first, with Solixte joining Tortuga and Hazel taking the throne of Viodoxa alongside former Archon Loic by her side. The two of them worked together, despite their feuds. The magisterium promptly backed off on both fronts, but the leaders of the alliance still assumed the Bardonians were active, so they decided to wait and see what they did next. Athaz's original plan to get Theos Esukdal, now Yimu Aldal, into the Southern Rathnir Defense Accords, but they ultimately settled for another loose alliance. Later, in early July, information revealed Bardonia assumed the SRDA were preparing to attack them, though as far as the leaders were concerned they were planning to defend against any further incursions into southern spheres of influence. Yazov acted as a spy for Hazel and told the leaders what was happening in Bardonia. Eventually the leaders learned what they wanted to, preemptively strike the south before they could mobilize. When the southern leaders found out about this development, they were enraged. There was no way in hell they were waiting for Bardonia to get to full strength. If they had to prepare, it meant they weren't ready. And Athaz began to push hard for a preemptive strike against them now that they had the intel. There was no way, according to him, that he could let these people allow them to fight the villain on their terms, and he felt, with what he knew about Aurora and Ulfang, that if they worked together, they would beat the Hands. In his eyes, the major preparations were already complete, and the Third Coalition began to take shape. When most people were convinced by the plan of preemptively striking, Hazel began to reach out to the leaders of the rebel groups within Bardonia, mainly Mokoslav Kowalski, the interim president of Free Ryzan. He was admitted to the Coalition's council as a representative of the separatist groups. From there, Coalition troops began to flood into the territories occupied by the rebels, eventually convening in the city of Carthia. A small task force, composed of the leaders of the IRGC and Coalition troops, marched on the city of Volgograd, storming the imperial residence of Jacob Azarov, signing a deal between the two which gave Free Ryzan the administrative power over all of Westreach's territories, in return for the leaders of the occupational government to be spared from punishment for collaboration. The Second Ryzani Republic had returned, and at 3 PM on the 26th of July 2021, Ryzan declared independence from Bardonia, and the Allium-Coalition War began. Thank you all very much for watching all the way through. This is part 2 of 3, so if you'd like to see more, please like and subscribe to quench the YouTube algorithm's thirst for clicks. If you have any insightful info I might have missed in this video, please comment down below, as I would greatly appreciate it. I'm now on page 10 of this script, and this took a very long time, so yes, there is plenty of hard work behind the scene going into these. I'll see you next time, and until then, have a wonderful day. This is Rex. Goodbye for now.